Have you ever wondered what it takes to change the course of human thought forever? What kind of mind could reshape how we understand reality, justice, and the very nature of existence itself? Well, the answer lies with one man, whose ideas have echoed through 24 centuries and continue to influence every aspect of our modern world. This is the story of Plato, the philosopher who dared to ask the questions that most people never even think to consider. The aristocrat who watched his teacher die for the crime of seeking truth. The visionary who founded the world's first university and created a blueprint for the perfect society that still haunts political theorists today. But here's what's truly remarkable about Plato's story. This wasn't just some ancient Greek sitting around pondering abstract concepts. This was a man thrust into the most turbulent period of Athenian history, watching democracy tear itself apart, witnessing the rise and fall of empires, and experiencing firsthand the brutal realities of power and corruption. By the end of this journey, you'll understand how one man's search for justice became the foundation of Western philosophy. You'll discover why his academy lasted nearly 1,000 years, and why every major thinker, from Augustine to modern scientists, still grapples with his ideas. Most importantly, you'll see how Plato's questions about the nature of reality and the good life remain as urgent today as they were in ancient Athens. Now, before we dive into this incredible story, I want you to imagine something. Picture yourself as a young aristocrat in the greatest city of the ancient world. You're wealthy, educated, destined for political power. Everything seems perfect until one devastating moment changes everything and forces you to question the very foundations of society itself. That moment and the man who inspired it would reshape human thought forever. The year was 428 BC, and Athens stood at the pinnacle of its power. The Parthenon gleamed white on the Acropolis, a testament to Athenian supremacy over the Greek world. Ships from across the Mediterranean crowded the harbour at Piraeus, bringing tribute from subject cities and exotic goods from distant lands. This was the Athens of Pericles, the golden age of democracy, art, and intellectual achievement. Into this world of marble and magnificence was born a boy named Aristocles, but history would remember him by a different name entirely: Plato. Some say the nickname came from his broad shoulders, earned through wrestling training. Others claimed it referred to his broad forehead, a sign of the intelligence that would one day astonish the world. Whatever the origin, the name stuck, and Aristocles faded into obscurity. But this wasn't just any aristocratic birth. Plato's family tree read like a who's who of Athenian royalty. On his father's side, he could trace his lineage back to Codrus, the legendary last king of Athens. His mother's family claimed descent from Solon, the great lawgiver who had laid the foundations of Athenian democracy 2 centuries earlier. This wasn't merely nobility. This was the aristocracy that had shaped Athens from its earliest days. Wealth and privilege surrounded the young Plato from birth. Slaves tended to household needs, while tutors provided the finest education money could buy. He learned to wrestle and run, training his body in the gymnasium. He studied music and mathematics, disciplines the Greeks believed revealed the hidden harmonies of the universe. Most importantly, he memorized Homer, reciting passages from the Iliad and Odyssey that every educated Greek was expected to know by heart. Everything in Plato's upbringing pointed toward a traditional life of public service. His family expected it. Athens demanded it. He was being groomed to take his place in the assembly, to command troops in battle, to govern the empire with wisdom and authority. The path seemed clear and inevitable, but the Athens of Plato's youth was not the confident empire his grandfather's generation had known. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the boy who would become history's greatest philosopher was about to witness democracy reveal its most terrifying possibilities. The Peloponnesian War had begun 3 years before Plato's birth, pitting Athens against Sparta in a struggle that would consume the Greek world for nearly 3 decades. This wasn't just a conflict between city-states, it was a clash of civilizations. Democracy versus oligarchy, naval power versus land power, the free exchange of ideas versus rigid military discipline. Plato's earliest memories would have been shaped by this endless conflict. The constant funeral processions as the dead returned from distant battlefields, the fear that gripped the city each summer when Spartan armies marched into Attica, burning farms and driving refugees behind Athens' protective walls, the heated debates in the assembly as demagogues promised easy victory, while generals warned of harsh realities. Yet despite the war's shadow, young Plato received an education befitting his aristocratic status. He trained with the best wrestling masters. His body hardened through rigorous exercise. He studied geometry with teachers who believed mathematical truths revealed eternal patterns beneath the chaos of the physical world. He learned to play the lyre and understand musical ratios, discovering how harmony could be expressed through precise numerical relationships. But perhaps most importantly, he was introduced to the art of rhetoric, the skill of persuasive speaking that was essential for any young man who hoped to succeed in democratic politics. In Athens, the ability to sway a crowd with eloquent arguments could mean the difference between political success and obscurity, between life and death in the law courts. As Plato entered adolescence, the war that had defined his childhood was taking an increasingly desperate turn. The brilliant strategy of Pericles, who had died when Plato was just a toddler, lay in ruins. A devastating plague had swept through overcrowded Athens, killing perhaps a quarter of the population. The city's resources were strained to the breaking point, and political leadership had passed to a new generation of ambitious men who promised glory but delivered only catastrophe. Among these figures was Alcibiades, a man who embodied everything, both magnificent and dangerous, about Athenian democracy. Handsome, wealthy, and charismatic beyond measure, he could entrance the assembly with his oratory and convince the people to pursue his wildest schemes. He was Athens personified, brilliant and self-destructive in equal measure, capable of inspiring devotion and wreaking havoc wherever he went. When Plato was about 13 years old, Alcibiades convinced the Athenian assembly to launch the most ambitious military expedition in the city's history. The Sicilian expedition, as it came to be known, was meant to conquer Syracuse and establish Athenian dominance over the western Mediterranean. 200 ships set sail, carrying the flower of Athenian youth, while crowds cheered from the harbour and dreams of easy conquest filled every mind. It ended in absolute disaster. Within 2 years, the entire expedition had been destroyed. Thousands of Athenian soldiers died in battle or perished as slaves in the stone quarries of Syracuse, their bodies broken under the merciless Sicilian sun. The ships that had sailed out in triumph returned as scattered remnants, bearing news of the greatest military catastrophe in Athenian history. For young Plato, watching these events unfold, the implications were staggering. The same democratic assembly that had cheered for the expedition now turned on the generals who had tried to salvage the disaster. The people who had demanded glory and conquest were quick to find scapegoats when their dreams turned to nightmares. Democracy, the system that Athens claimed made it superior to Sparta's rigid oligarchy, seemed capable of the most irrational and self-destructive decisions. The seeds of Plato's later critique of democracy were planted during these formative years. He watched the assembly swing wildly from confidence to panic, from one policy to its complete opposite, often within a matter of weeks. He observed how skilled speakers could manipulate the crowd through appeals to emotion rather than reason, how the promise of easy solutions could override careful deliberation. This wasn't theoretical for the young aristocrat. His own relatives were deeply involved in the political struggles that followed the Sicilian disaster. Some, like his mother's cousin Critias, were becoming convinced that democracy itself was the problem, that Athens needed the steady hand of the best men to rule without interference from the ignorant masses. The war ground on, consuming resources and lives with relentless efficiency. Athens, once the undisputed master of the Aegean Sea, found itself increasingly desperate and isolated. The treasury that had built the Parthenon was empty. The tribute from subject cities had dried up as one ally after another defected to Sparta. The long walls that connected Athens to its port lay in ruins, torn down by Spartan victors who wanted to humiliate their defeated enemy. But amidst this chaos and decline, a strange figure walked the streets of Athens, asking questions that made powerful men squirm with discomfort. He was short and ugly, with a snub nose and protruding eyes. He went barefoot, even in winter, and wore the same rough cloak year-round. By all conventional measures, he was a failure, a man of no property or position. Yet the young men of Athens, including Plato himself, were drawn to this peculiar character, like moths to a flame. His name was Socrates, and he would change everything Plato thought he knew about wisdom, virtue, and the examined life. The first encounter between teacher and student probably occurred when Plato was about 20 years old, sometime around 408 BC. By then, Socrates had already spent decades developing his unique method of inquiry, a systematic form of questioning that could reduce the most confident speaker to confused silence. Imagine the scene in Athens' great marketplace, the Agora, where citizens gathered to conduct business, hear news, and engage in the kind of political discussion that was the lifeblood of democratic society. A prominent general might be holding forth on the nature of courage, drawing on his extensive battlefield experience to explain what separates the brave from the cowardly. Then Socrates would approach, polite and curious, asking seemingly innocent questions. What exactly is courage? Is it simply standing firm in battle? But what about tactical retreats, when wise commanders withdraw to fight another day? So courage must involve wisdom. But what kind of wisdom? And how do we distinguish between wise courage and foolish recklessness? Within minutes, the confident general would find himself tied in logical knots, unable to provide a coherent definition of a concept he had spent his entire career embodying. The crowd would watch in fascination as Socrates demonstrated that this respected leader, despite decades of experience, could not actually explain what courage was. This was dangerous and thrilling in equal measure. Dangerous because it undermined the authority of Athens' political and military elite, exposing their ignorance in the most public possible forum. Thrilling because it was honest, cutting through pretense and conventional wisdom to reveal uncomfortable truths about the limits of human knowledge. For Plato, this was a revelation that would reshape his entire understanding of what it meant to be wise. Here was a man who claimed to know nothing, yet consistently exposed the emptiness of others' confident assertions. Socrates had developed what would later be called the elenctic method, a form of cross-examination that revealed the contradictions hidden within seemingly solid beliefs. But Socrates was utterly different from the sophists who dominated Athenian intellectual life. These professional teachers charged enormous fees to instruct young aristocrats in the art of rhetoric, promising to make them successful in politics and the law courts. They claimed they could teach anyone to argue either side of any question and win through clever manipulation of language and emotion. Socrates despised everything the sophists represented. He took no money for his conversations. He claimed to teach nothing because he insisted he knew nothing. He wasn't interested in winning arguments, but in discovering truth. While the sophists promised practical success, Socrates offered something far more challenging and valuable. He offered the possibility of genuine wisdom through rigorous self-examination. The method was devastatingly simple. Socrates would take a concept that everyone thought they understood, something like justice or piety or friendship, and through patient questioning, demonstrate that nobody could actually define it coherently. The process was often humiliating for his conversation partners, but it was also liberating. By clearing away false certainties, Socrates created space for genuine inquiry. Among the young men who gathered around this strange philosopher were some of the most prominent names in Athens. Alcibiades himself had been a companion of Socrates before his political career consumed him. Critias, Plato's own relative, was fascinated by Socratic questioning. Charmides, Plato's uncle, was another regular participant in these philosophical discussions. This was intoxicating for a young aristocrat like Plato. Here was an alternative to the corrupt world of Athenian politics, a way of life dedicated to truth rather than power, to wisdom rather than wealth. Socrates embodied a completely different set of values from those that dominated Athenian society. He was poor but free, ugly on the outside but beautiful within, powerless by conventional standards, yet possessed of a kind of strength that generals and politicians could never match. The conversations often took place in the gymnasium or the agora, anywhere young men gathered to exercise or socialize. Socrates would pose a question that seemed simple on the surface, but proved endlessly complex upon examination. What is justice? What is virtue? What is the good life? How should we live? These weren't academic exercises, but urgent, practical questions about how human beings should conduct themselves. What made Socrates' approach so compelling was his genuine humility. Unlike the sophists who claimed to possess wisdom, or the politicians who acted as if they knew how to govern, Socrates freely admitted his ignorance. The oracle at Delphi had supposedly declared him the wisest man in Athens, but Socrates interpreted this to mean that his wisdom consisted precisely in knowing that he didn't know. This created a paradox that would haunt Plato for the rest of his life. The wisest man was the one who claimed to know nothing. True knowledge seemed to consist in the recognition of one's own ignorance. But if this was the case, how could anyone ever claim to know anything for certain? How could society function if its leaders admitted they didn't really understand justice or virtue or the good? The intensity of these philosophical discussions was matched by the growing political crisis engulfing Athens. By 404 BC, when Plato was in his mid-20s, the long war with Sparta had finally ended in total defeat. The proud democracy that had ruled the Aegean for decades lay prostrate before its enemies. The long walls were torn down to the sound of flutes, a humiliation designed to announce that Athens' imperial age was finished forever. But the Spartans didn't simply impose their own rule on the defeated city. Instead, they installed a puppet government composed of Athenian aristocrats who had long argued that democracy was the source of all the city's problems. These 30 men, as they came to be known, seized power with Spartan backing and immediately launched a reign of terror that would make the worst excesses of democratic faction seem mild by comparison. Critias, Plato's own relative, was among the leaders of this oligarchic government. The young men who had sat at Socrates' feet, asking questions about justice and virtue, were now overseeing executions and confiscations. The 30 needed money to pay their Spartan garrison, and murder proved to be an efficient form of fundraising. Within months, they had killed 1,500 Athenian citizens without trial, targeting political enemies and wealthy residents whose property could be seized. The city lived in terror. Informants lurked everywhere. A casual denunciation could mean death. Families fled into exile while their property was distributed among the oligarchs' supporters. This was what rule by the best men looked like in practice. This was the alternative to democracy that aristocrats like Plato's relatives had long advocated. In this nightmare scenario, Socrates faced a crucial test. The 30 summoned him, along with 4 other men, and ordered them to arrest Leon of Salamis, a wealthy citizen marked for execution. It was both a test of loyalty and an attempt to implicate more Athenians in the regime's crimes. spreading guilt so widely that resistance would become impossible. Socrates listened to the order. Then he simply went home. He offered no dramatic speech, made no public protest. He just refused to participate. The other 4 men carried out the arrest, and Leon was duly murdered. Socrates did nothing, and in doing nothing, committed an act of profound moral courage. For Plato, watching this unfold, the contrast must have been unbearable. His own relatives, men of education and culture, were committing atrocities in the name of good government. Meanwhile, the strange barefoot philosopher, the man Athens mocked as eccentric and useless, was the only one with the moral clarity to simply say no. The reign of the 30 lasted only 8 months. Democratic exiles led by Thrasybulus gathered forces and marched on Athens. In the brief civil war that followed, Critias and Charmides were both killed fighting against the returning Democrats. The oligarchy collapsed, the Spartan garrison withdrew, and democracy was restored in 403 BC. But the restored democracy was not magnanimous. It was traumatized, bitter, and paranoid. An amnesty was declared forbidding prosecution for actions during the tyranny, but everyone knew who had collaborated and who had resisted. The city was divided and suspicious, looking for enemies within its own walls. And so the restored democracy, seeking scapegoats and determined to purge itself of any threat to stability, turned its attention to the man who had questioned everything, whose students had included both the worst tyrants and the most dangerous freethinkers Athens had ever produced. The trial of Socrates in 399 BC was the culmination of decades of resentment and fear. The charges were vague but deadly: impiety toward the gods of Athens and corrupting the youth. Behind the legal language lay a simpler accusation. Socrates asked too many questions, and some of his former students had become tyrants. The courtroom was packed with 500 citizens selected by lot, ordinary men tasked with deciding whether the strange philosopher deserved to live or die. Socrates could have saved himself with a traditional defense involving tears and pleading, perhaps bringing his 3 sons forward to beg for mercy. Athenian juries were notoriously susceptible to emotional appeals. Instead, Socrates did what he had always done. He asked questions. He spoke calmly and rationally, even suggesting that far from deserving death, he deserved to be fed at public expense as a benefactor of the city. After all, he had spent his entire life trying to improve his fellow citizens, stinging them into awareness like a gadfly awakening a lazy horse. The jury was not amused. The first vote was close: 280 for conviction, 220 for acquittal. But when asked to propose an alternative to death, Socrates offered to pay a small fine, making his contempt for the proceedings clear. The second vote was wider. More jurors voted for execution after hearing his defiance than had voted for guilt in the first place. Socrates accepted the verdict with unsettling serenity. He told the jury that no evil can come to a good man, either in life or after death. He declared that the unexamined life is not worth living. Then he was led away to await execution, calm and unafraid. For Plato, sitting in that courtroom, watching the wisest man in Athens condemned to death by the democratic city he loved, something fundamental broke. The injustice of it split open a question that would consume the next 50 years of his life. If Athens could kill Socrates and call it lawful, what did justice even mean? How could the best man be destroyed by the worst system? And if democracy could make such a catastrophic error, what form of government could ever be trusted with power over human lives? These questions would drive Plato to travel the Mediterranean world, to establish a school that would outlast the Roman Empire, and to write dialogues that would shape human thought for millennia. The death of Socrates was not just the end of a life, but the beginning of a philosophical revolution that continues to this day. The execution took place 30 days later, delayed by a religious festival that prohibited taking life while the sacred ship sailed to Delos. During those weeks, Socrates remained in his small prison cell, receiving visitors and engaging in the same philosophical conversations that had defined his life. His friends came desperate and grieving, hatching elaborate escape plans that would have spirited him away to safety in northern Greece. Socrates refused every offer. In conversations later recreated by Plato in the dialogue Crito, the old philosopher argued that escaping would violate the very principles he had spent his life defending. He had lived under Athens' laws for 70 years, benefiting from their protection and raising his children under their shelter. To break those laws now, simply because they worked against him, would make him a hypocrite and undermine everything he claimed to believe about justice. When the final day arrived, Socrates spent his last hours in philosophical discussion, calmly exploring questions about the soul's immortality with perfect composure. According to Phaedo's account, when the jailer brought the cup of hemlock, Socrates took it without hesitation, asked if he could pour a libation to the gods, and upon learning there was only enough for the fatal dose, smiled and drank it down in one steady motion. The poison worked its way upward from his feet, gradually numbing his body, while his mind remained clear until the very end. His last words were strange and have puzzled interpreters ever since. Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Pay the debt and do not neglect it. Asclepius was the god of healing, and the sacrifice of a rooster was traditionally offered after recovery from illness. Was Socrates suggesting that death was itself a cure, a healing, a release from the sickness of embodied existence? Plato was not present for the execution. The dialogue records that he was ill, though whether this was physical sickness or simply grief, too overwhelming to bear, remains one of history's small mysteries. The man who would spend the rest of his life writing dialogues featuring Socrates as the hero could not bring himself to witness his teacher's final moments. In the immediate aftermath, fear gripped Socrates' followers. The democracy had demonstrated its willingness to kill an old man for asking questions. Association with the condemned philosopher was now dangerous, potentially marking one as disloyal to the restored city. Plato, already from a family tainted by collaboration with the 30 tyrants, had every reason to leave Athens immediately. He fled to Megara, a small city-state about 25 miles west of Athens, seeking refuge with Euclid, not the famous mathematician, but a philosopher devoted to Socrates who had risked his life during the Reign of Terror to hear his master speak. For a time, the Socratic circle reconstituted itself in exile, continuing their discussions in the safety of Euclid's home. But Plato could not remain still. Over the next 12 years, from 399 to 387 BC, he travelled extensively throughout the Mediterranean world, searching for wisdom that Athens could no longer provide. The exact details of his journeys remain uncertain, pieced together from fragments and later biographical traditions, but the broad outline reveals a man desperate to understand how the catastrophe he had witnessed could be prevented in the future. Some sources claim he travelled to Cyrene in North Africa, studying mathematics with Theodorus, whose work on irrational numbers fascinated Greek geometers. Mathematics was becoming central to Plato's thinking, offering a realm of certainty and eternal truth that stood in stark contrast to the chaos and flux of political life. Other traditions suggest he journeyed to Egypt, learning from the priests of Memphis and Heliopolis, though modern scholars remain skeptical about these claims. What is certain is that Plato's most transformative journey took him to southern Italy, to the Greek colonies known as Magna Graecia. Here he encountered the Pythagorean communities that would fundamentally reshape his understanding of reality itself. In the city of Tarentum, he met Archytas, one of the most remarkable figures of the age. Archytas was a Pythagorean philosopher, but unlike the mystical reputation that often surrounded followers of Pythagoras, he was a brilliant mathematician and scientist who worked on complex problems in geometry and acoustics. More importantly for Plato's future development, Archytas was also a successful statesman, elected general of Tarentum multiple times and respected as both just and effective in his leadership. Here was living proof that philosophy and politics need not be incompatible. Here was a man who could contemplate eternal mathematical truths and still govern a city with wisdom and justice. The possibility that had seemed destroyed by Socrates' execution suddenly appeared viable again, embodied in this Pythagorean philosopher-ruler. The Pythagoreans believed that numbers were the foundation of all reality, not merely useful tools for counting or measuring, but the actual substance from which the cosmos was constructed. They had discovered that musical harmony could be expressed through mathematical ratios, that the intervals pleasing to the human ear corresponded to simple, numerical relationships. If beauty in sound was mathematical, perhaps all beauty followed mathematical principles. Perhaps the entire structure of the universe, from the movements of celestial bodies to the virtues of the human soul, was fundamentally numerical. This mathematical mysticism was combined with a belief in the soul's immortality and its journey through multiple incarnations. The soul was divine, but trapped in the material body like a prisoner in a cell. Through philosophical contemplation, mathematical study, and ethical purification, the soul could gradually free itself from this imprisonment and return to its proper divine state. For Plato, devastated by Athens' failures and haunted by his teacher's death, this Pythagorean worldview offered a compelling framework for understanding his experiences. The perfect justice he sought did not exist in any earthly city, because all physical things were flawed and temporary. But perhaps justice existed in a higher realm, a dimension of eternal and perfect forms, accessible through reason and mathematical understanding. The seeds of Plato's most famous doctrine, the theory of forms, were planted during these months among the Pythagorean communities of southern Italy. But it was his subsequent journey to Sicily that would bring him face to face with tyranny in its most brutal manifestation and test whether philosophy could ever truly transform political power. Syracuse was the largest and most powerful Greek city in the Western Mediterranean, a sprawling metropolis that had grown wealthy through trade and conquest. For nearly 40 years it had been ruled by Dionysius I, one of the most successful tyrants in the Greek world. The word tyrant in ancient Greek did not necessarily imply cruelty, though Dionysius could certainly be cruel when it served his purposes. It simply meant someone who had seized power outside the normal constitutional framework and ruled through force rather than law. Dionysius had transformed Syracuse into a military powerhouse and himself into an absolute ruler whose word was law. His court was a study in contradictions, combining immense luxury with pervasive paranoia. Banquets featured the finest poets and musicians brought from across the Greek world. The tyrant himself fancied himself a tragic playwright and forced audiences to endure his dramatic compositions. But beneath this cultural veneer lay constant fear and suspicion. Dionysius trusted no one completely. He changed his sleeping quarters nightly to avoid assassination. He had his barber executed and afterwards shaved himself with a hot coal rather than risk a blade near his throat. The royal treasury was protected by a moat that could only be crossed by a single drawbridge, which the tyrant alone could operate from inside the fortified chamber. When Plato arrived in Syracuse around 388 BC, now about 40 years old, he quickly attracted attention at this bizarre court. His reputation as a philosopher and his association with the Pythagoreans made him an object of curiosity among the intellectuals and aristocrats who surrounded the tyrant. Most significantly, he encountered a young man named Dion, the brother-in-law of Dionysius and husband to the tyrant's sister. Dion was in his early 20s, aristocratic, educated, and profoundly dissatisfied with the empty luxury and moral corruption that characterized life at the Syracusan court. When he heard Plato speak about philosophy, about the life dedicated to truth and virtue rather than power and pleasure, something ignited within him. Dion became Plato's devoted student, convinced that philosophy offered the key to transforming not just individual souls, but entire political systems. Plato, for his part, began lecturing at the court about justice, virtue, and the nature of true rulership. Drawing on his years of study and reflection, he argued that genuine political authority must be grounded in wisdom rather than mere force. A ruler who governed through violence and deception was actually a slave to his own fears and desires, constantly anxious about potential threats and unable to trust anyone around him. Only a philosopher, someone who understood the good and lived virtuously, could rule with true freedom and genuine authority. Such a ruler would govern not for personal advantage, but for the benefit of the entire community, creating conditions where justice and happiness could flourish for all citizens. At some point, with characteristic boldness that bordered on naivety, Plato began to criticize tyranny itself directly. He suggested that tyrants, despite their apparent power, were actually the most wretched of human beings, prisoners of their own system, surrounded by enemies both real and imagined, unable to form genuine friendships or experience true happiness. Dionysius I was not pleased with these philosophical lectures that seemed to undermine the very foundations of his rule. The details of what happened next vary in different ancient accounts, but the outcome was unmistakably clear. Plato had seriously overstepped, insulting his host and threatening the stability that kept the tyrant in power. Whether through direct order or more subtle arrangement, Dionysius ensured that the philosopher's departure from Syracuse would be permanent and humiliating. He handed Plato over to Polis, a Spartan ambassador returning home by ship. When the vessel stopped at the island of Aegina, a state that harbored deep hatred for Athens due to past conflicts, Polis sold Plato into slavery. It was a calculated cruelty designed to destroy not just Plato's freedom, but his entire future. Slaves had no rights, no prospects, no hope of continuing their philosophical work. The man who had dared to lecture a tyrant about justice could have ended his days labouring in obscurity, his brilliant mind wasted in menial tasks. Fortune intervened in the form of Aniceris, a philosopher from Cyrene who happened to be on Aegina and recognised Plato despite his degraded circumstances. Aniceris purchased the philosopher's freedom, paying what some sources claim was 20 minae, enough to buy a skilled craftsman. Plato returned to Athens shaken and humiliated, but also strangely determined. He had attempted to bring philosophy into direct contact with political power, to convince a tyrant through rational argument and moral suasion. The result had been complete disaster. Philosophy and brute force, it seemed, spoke entirely different languages. The tyrant cared nothing for arguments about justice or the good life. He cared only about maintaining control, eliminating threats, and preserving his dominance through whatever means necessary. Yet Plato was not ready to abandon the central question that had driven him since Socrates' death. Could philosophy ever truly transform politics, or must wisdom and power remain forever separate, dwelling in different worlds that could never meet without mutual destruction? Back in Athens, now 40 years old and bearing the scars of his Sicilian adventure, Plato made a decision that would echo through the centuries and transform humanity's understanding of education itself. Rather than retreating from the world entirely or attempting once more to influence existing rulers, he would create something entirely new. He would establish an institution dedicated to the systematic pursuit of truth, a place where future philosopher kings could be properly educated before they ever encountered the corrupting influence of political power. In 387 BC, Plato purchased a plot of land in a sacred grove about a mile northwest of Athens' walls. The site was named after Academus, a legendary Athenian hero, and it offered everything the philosopher needed: olive trees for shade, quiet streams for reflection, and enough distance from the city to ensure peaceful contemplation away from the dust and noise of political life. Here Plato founded his academy. It was not the first place in Athens where philosophy was taught, but it was fundamentally different from anything that had come before. While sophists gathered temporary students around individual teachers, the academy was designed to be permanent, institutional, a community dedicated to learning that would outlast its founder. It was, in effect, the world's first university. The academy began modestly, with little more than the natural beauty of the grove and a few simple structures for lectures and communal dining. But what it lacked in grand architecture, it more than compensated for in revolutionary vision. This wasn't merely another school where students came to learn practical skills or prepare for careers. This was something unprecedented in human history, an institution dedicated to the systematic pursuit of eternal truth. Mathematics formed the bedrock of the academy's curriculum, treated not as a separate subject, but as the gateway to genuine philosophical understanding. Geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and harmonics weren't taught in isolation, but as interconnected paths toward comprehending the underlying structure of reality itself. According to later tradition, an inscription was placed over the academy's entrance reading, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." While the saying may be legendary, it perfectly captures the spirit of Plato's educational philosophy. Mathematics trained the mind to think about unchanging eternal truths rather than the fleeting appearances that deceive the senses. Only after mastering these mathematical disciplines would a student progress to dialectic, the formalized version of the Socratic method that Plato had witnessed in Athens' marketplaces years earlier. Here, students learn to argue with rigorous precision, to define terms exactly, to expose hidden contradictions, and to construct logical proofs that could withstand the most intense scrutiny. Philosophy, as Plato conceived it, was never about memorizing doctrines or accepting received wisdom. It was about learning how to think, how to question assumptions, how to pursue truth through systematic inquiry. The academy attracted brilliant young minds from across the Greek world, drawn by the promise of an education that offered something far more valuable than rhetorical tricks or political connections. But perhaps most remarkably for its time, the academy was not exclusively male. At least 2 women are known to have studied there, including Axiothea of Phlius, who according to tradition wore men's clothing to attend lectures. In a culture that largely excluded women from public intellectual life, this was nothing short of revolutionary. Plato's commitment to the life of the mind transcended conventional social boundaries. Within this community of scholars, walking the garden paths and debating under ancient olive trees, Plato began composing the works that would define his lasting legacy. He wrote dialogues, dramatic conversations that placed Socrates at the center, reconstructing not just his method, but his living voice. The early dialogues, written soon after his teacher's death, were probably faithful to actual conversations Plato had witnessed. They were short, inconclusive, focused on defining single concepts like piety or courage. But as Plato matured and his own philosophical vision developed, the dialogues evolved into something far more complex and ambitious. They became longer, more intricate, less tied to the historical Socrates, and more vehicles for Plato's own revolutionary ideas. He wrote the Symposium, a brilliant exploration of love, set at a drinking party, where each guest offers a different perspective on the nature of desire and beauty. He composed the Phaedo, dramatizing Socrates' final hours, while presenting arguments for the soul's immortality that would influence religious thought for centuries. The Meno demonstrated through careful questioning of an untutored slave boy that learning is actually recollection, the soul remembering truths it knew before birth. These weren't dry philosophical treatises, but works of extraordinary literary artistry, featuring vivid characters, humour, and dramatic tension. They were designed to be read aloud, shared in the Academy's evening gatherings, discussed and debated by students who found themselves drawn into the very process of inquiry they depicted. Through these dialogues, Plato kept Socrates alive in a way that physical monuments never could. Decades after the hemlock had done its work, Socrates remained the protagonist, the questioner, the moral centre of philosophical discourse. Plato ensured that his teacher's voice would never be silenced, that the questions which had cost Socrates his life would continue to challenge and inspire future generations. The Academy became a living organism of intellectual inquiry, its members bound together not by family ties or political allegiances, but by shared commitment to understanding. Students and teachers strolled the garden paths, their conversations ranging from the movements of celestial bodies to the nature of justice, from mathematical proofs to the structure of the ideal state. They held symposia, philosophical drinking parties where ideas flowed as freely as wine, where the pursuit of truth became a form of celebration. As the Academy's reputation spread throughout the Mediterranean world, it attracted increasingly distinguished visitors and students. Young men from wealthy families made the journey to Athens specifically to study with Plato, carrying the school's methods and ideas back to their home cities. The influence was subtle but profound, like seeds scattered on fertile ground, taking root in minds that would themselves become teachers and leaders. Among the remarkable individuals who found their way to the Academy's gates was a 17-year-old from the northern kingdom of Macedon. His name was Aristotle, and he would remain for 20 years, becoming first Plato's most brilliant student and eventually his greatest critic. The relationship between these two giants of philosophy would prove as complex and influential as any in intellectual history. Plato reportedly called the young Macedonian the mind, in recognition of his extraordinary analytical abilities. But he also supposedly referred to him as the foal, the young horse that kicks, perhaps sensing that this student would not simply absorb doctrine, but challenge and transform it. The debates between master and pupil must have been intense, conducted along the Academy's shaded paths, with other students gathering to witness these clashes of philosophical titans. While the Academy flourished and attracted the brightest minds of the age, Plato was simultaneously crafting his most ambitious and controversial work. The Republic, composed during his mature period in the 380s or 370s BC, would become perhaps the most influential political treatise ever written. Framed as a conversation Socrates had years earlier, it began with a deceptively simple question: what is justice? To answer this fundamental query, Socrates proposes examining justice writ large in an entire city, rather than trying to discern it in the individual soul where it might be too small and subtle to see clearly. What follows is a systematic construction of the ideal state, built from the ground up according to rational principles rather than historical accident or traditional custom. The perfect city that emerges from this thought experiment is divided into three distinct classes, each corresponding to a part of the human soul. The producers, including farmers, craftsmen, and merchants, represent the appetitive part that seeks food, wealth, and pleasure. The auxiliaries, the warrior class, embody the spirited element that feels anger, pride, and the drive for honor. The guardians, the ruling class, correspond to reason, the part of the soul capable of understanding, judging, and governing wisely. Justice in both city and soul consists of each part performing its proper function without interference. The producers produce, the warriors protect, the guardians rule, and harmony prevails. But the most shocking proposals in the Republic concern the guardians themselves. To prevent them from developing private interests that might conflict with the common good, Plato strips them of private property entirely. They own nothing individually, living in communal barracks and dining at common tables. Even more radically, they have no private families. Children are raised collectively by the state, with parents not knowing which children are theirs, and children not knowing their biological parents. This prevents nepotism and ensures that guardians care for the entire city as their family, rather than favouring their own bloodlines over the common welfare. Most revolutionary of all for 4th century Greek sensibilities, Plato insists that women can serve as guardians on equal terms with men. If a woman possesses the intelligence, courage, and love of wisdom necessary for rule, then she should be educated and trained exactly as male guardians are. Gender is irrelevant to virtue and governing ability. This was a direct assault on Greek assumptions about the natural inferiority of women, challenging fundamental cultural beliefs about social organisation. But who among the guardians actually rules this ideal city? Not just any member of the ruling class, but only those rare individuals who have undergone decades of education in mathematics and dialectic and have come to understand the forms themselves. These philosopher kings have glimpsed the eternal truths that lie beyond the physical world, particularly the form of the good, the highest reality that illuminates and gives meaning to everything else. Plato explains this through one of Western philosophy's most famous images, the allegory of the cave. Imagine prisoners chained in a dark underground chamber since childhood, able to see only shadows cast on the wall before them by a fire burning behind them. These shadows represent all of reality as far as the prisoners know. Now picture one prisoner being freed, turning to see the fire and the objects that cast the shadows, then being dragged up into the sunlight, where he gradually adjusts his vision and sees the true world illuminated by the sun itself. This represents the philosopher's journey from ignorance to knowledge, from the world of appearances to the realm of eternal forms. Most people spend their entire lives seeing only shadows, mistaking physical objects and conventional opinions for ultimate reality. The philosopher, through proper education, escapes this cave of illusion and perceives truth itself. But justice requires that he return to help free others, even though they may resist and attack him for challenging their comfortable delusions. The Republic concludes with the myth of Air, an account of the soul's journey after death. Air, a soldier killed in battle, returns to life to report what he witnessed in the afterlife. Souls are judged according to how they lived, with the just rewarded and the unjust punished. Then all souls choose their next incarnations. Most choose foolishly, seduced by power or pleasure, without understanding their true consequences. But Odysseus, wisest of all, having learned from his sufferings, chooses last and selects the quiet life of a private citizen, having discovered that contemplation brings more happiness than worldly glory. The Republic was and remains deeply controversial. Is it a sincere blueprint for the perfect state, or a warning about what political perfection would actually require? The abolition of family, the censorship of poetry, the rule by philosophical elite. These elements have inspired utopian dreamers and horrified defenders of individual freedom for over 2 millennia. But at its core, the dialogue grapples with the question that had tormented Plato since that day in the Athenian courtroom. What is justice, and can it ever truly exist in human society? Underlying this political vision was Plato's revolutionary metaphysical theory, his answer to the problem that had puzzled Greek thinkers for generations. How can we have genuine knowledge of a world that never stops changing? Heraclitus had declared that you cannot step into the same river twice because the water is always flowing. But Heraclitus went further. Everything is in constant flux. If all things are always becoming rather than being, how can we know anything certain? Plato's solution was as elegant as it was radical. Reality consists not of one realm, but two. The first is the physical world we perceive through our senses, the world of becoming, where everything changes constantly. Here we find particular things. This horse, that tree, this beautiful face. All are imperfect, temporary, coming into existence and passing away. Because this realm is always in flux, we can have only opinions about it, never certain knowledge. The second realm is invisible to the senses but accessible to reason. This is the world of the forms, eternal and perfect realities that exist independently of any physical manifestation. Beauty itself, justice itself, goodness itself, these are not abstract concepts but the most real things in existence. Physical objects are real only insofar as they participate in or imitate these eternal forms. Consider the concept of equality. We see many things that appear equal. Two stones of similar size, two lines of comparable length, but examine them closely, and none are perfectly equal. Yet when geometers prove theorems about equality, they are discovering truths about perfect equality itself, which no physical objects can fully embody. The form of equality is eternal, unchanging, and more real than any particular equal things we encounter in the physical world. This theory explained how knowledge was possible despite the constant change in the physical realm. Mathematics deals directly with the forms, which is why mathematical truths are eternal and certain. The Pythagorean theorem was true before humans existed and will remain true after humanity disappears. When we learn geometry, we are not acquiring information from the physical world, but recollecting truths our souls knew before birth when they existed in the realm of forms. But if the forms are eternal and separate from us, how do we gain access to them? Plato's answer was the doctrine of recollection or anamnesis. Learning is not the acquisition of new information, but the recovery of knowledge the soul already possesses, but has forgotten through the trauma of embodiment. In the Meno dialogue, Socrates demonstrates this by leading an untutored slave boy to discover complex geometric truths through questioning alone, never teaching him anything directly. At the apex of all forms stands the form of the good, the source of truth and being for everything else. Plato struggled to describe this ultimate reality, resorting to analogies and metaphors. The form of the good is to the intelligible realm what the sun is to the visible world. It makes knowledge possible and gives reality to the objects of knowledge, just as the sun makes vision possible and gives life to physical objects. This metaphysical vision provided the foundation for Plato's educational program at the Academy. Students progressed from mathematics, which trained them to think about eternal truths, to dialectic, which enabled them to grasp the forms themselves through pure reasoning. The ultimate goal was to ascend intellectually from the world of shadows and reflections to the blazing reality of the forms, culminating in a vision of the good itself. The soul that achieved this vision would be transformed, no longer satisfied with the pursuit of wealth, power, or physical pleasure. Having seen true reality, such a person would be equipped to rule wisely, governing according to eternal principles of justice, rather than temporary advantage or popular opinion. This was how philosophers could become kings, not through political ambition, but through intellectual and spiritual purification that revealed the unchanging standards by which all human affairs should be measured. But even as Plato developed these sublime theories and built his academy into the ancient world's premier centre of learning, the practical question of philosophy's relationship to political power continued to haunt him. The disaster in Syracuse had shown that existing rulers could not be easily converted to philosophical wisdom. But what if a ruler could be educated from youth, shaped by philosophical principles before the corruptions of power took hold? This possibility would soon present itself in the most dramatic and dangerous way imaginable, pulling the aging philosopher back into the treacherous waters of Sicilian politics for a final test of whether wisdom and power could ever truly unite. The opportunity arose in 367 BC when a ship arrived from Syracuse bearing news that would change everything. Dionysius I, the tyrant who had humiliated Plato decades earlier, was dead. His son, Dionysius II, had inherited the throne at Syracuse, but unlike his father, the young ruler was untested, insecure, and surrounded by competing factions vying for influence over his inexperienced mind. Into this volatile situation stepped Dion, now middle-aged but still burning with the philosophical passion Plato had ignited in him during that first disastrous visit to Sicily. Dion saw something his teacher perhaps could not yet perceive. Here was a blank slate, a young tyrant not yet hardened by decades of paranoia and cruelty. If Plato could come to Syracuse and become the educator of this malleable ruler, perhaps the impossible dream could finally be realized. Perhaps the Republic could be made flesh. The letters that arrived at the academy were urgent, almost desperate in their appeal. Dion argued that this opportunity would never come again. The young Dionysius was curious about philosophy, impressed by learning, eager to be seen as enlightened rather than merely powerful. But he was also weak-willed, easily influenced by flatterers and rivals. Without proper guidance, he would inevitably become another tyrant in the mold of his father. With philosophical education, he could be transformed into something unprecedented in the Greek world, a genuine philosopher king. Plato was 60 years old. He had been teaching at the academy for 2 decades, surrounded by brilliant students and engaged in the work he loved most. He had projects to complete, dialogues to write, a school to govern. The idea of returning to Syracuse, scene of his greatest humiliation, must have filled him with dread. He had no illusions about the dangers involved, or the likelihood of success. Yet Dion's appeal struck at the very core of everything Plato believed. If philosophy could not change the world, if the ideal city could never be more than words on papyrus, then what had been the point of all his work? The Republic was not meant to be mere intellectual exercise, but a blueprint for actual human societies. The academy was not designed to produce scholars who would spend their lives in comfortable contemplation, but philosopher rulers who would transform politics itself. The decision tormented him. He consulted with his closest associates at the academy, including Aristotle, now about 20 years old and already displaying the formidable intellect that would one day challenge his master's most fundamental assumptions. Most advised against the journey. Syracuse was notorious for its political instability, its atmosphere of suspicion and violence. Plato was no longer young enough to survive another disaster like his first Sicilian adventure. But duty to his principles, loyalty to Dion, and perhaps a flicker of hope that refused to die finally compelled him to accept. He arranged for the academy to continue in his absence, placed his most trusted associates in charge of ongoing instruction, and boarded a ship bound for Sicily. As the vessel sailed west across the wine-dark Mediterranean, Plato must have wondered whether he was travelling toward vindication or destruction. The initial signs in Syracuse were remarkably promising. Dionysius II greeted the famous philosopher with public honours and apparent enthusiasm. The palace, that fortress of tyranny, where intrigue and fear had reigned for decades, suddenly became an impromptu academy. Geometric diagrams appeared scratched into the floors where courtiers walked. Aristocrats who had never given serious thought to anything beyond pleasure and advancement found themselves discussing the nature of justice and virtue, or at least pretending to do so because the tyrant's favour seemed to depend on philosophical sophistication. For a brief shining moment, it appeared that the impossible was actually happening. Here was a ruler who genuinely seemed interested in wisdom rather than merely the appearance of wisdom. Palace guards observed their master spending hours in earnest conversation with the Athenian philosopher, covering wax tablets with mathematical proofs and dialectical arguments. The young tyrant appeared to be undergoing the kind of intellectual and moral transformation that Plato had described in his writings, but never witnessed in practice. But appearances, as Plato knew better than anyone, could be deceiving. Beneath the philosophical veneer, the same deadly currents that had always characterized Syracusan court life continued to flow with undiminished force. Dionysius II was intelligent enough to be fascinated by philosophical ideas, but he lacked the discipline and strength of character necessary to live according to philosophical principles. More dangerously, he was caught between conflicting influences that would ultimately tear his regime apart. Dion's position at court as the tyrant's brother-in-law, and a man of genuine principle and popularity among the people, made him a natural target for rivals who feared his influence over the impressionable young ruler. Whispers began circulating that Dion was using Plato to manipulate Dionysius, perhaps even plotting to overthrow him and seize power for himself. The philosophical education that was supposed to create wisdom was being interpreted as political subversion. The crisis came to a head when rivals convinced the increasingly paranoid tyrant that his brother-in-law posed an immediate threat to his rule. In a decision that revealed the true limits of his philosophical conversion, Dionysius II chose security over justice. He exiled Dion from Syracuse, confiscating his vast properties and sending him into permanent banishment. The man who had made the philosophical experiment possible, who had sacrificed everything to bring wisdom to power, was cast out like a common criminal. But the young tyrant was not finished with his philosophical education. He kept Plato in Syracuse, ostensibly as an honoured guest, but increasingly as a prisoner whose freedom depended entirely on royal whim. The aging philosopher found himself trapped in an impossible situation: a teacher whose most devoted student had been banished, a guest who could not leave, a moral authority in a court where morality had become a luxury that could not be afforded. Dionysius II did not want genuine wisdom, as Plato gradually came to understand. He wanted the prestige of having a famous philosopher at his court, the appearance of enlightenment without the demanding work of becoming just. He enjoyed the intellectual stimulation of philosophical conversation, but when those conversations challenged his power or convenience, they were quickly abandoned. Philosophy, for this ruler, was decoration rather than discipline, entertainment rather than transformation. Months dragged by with Plato making increasingly clear his desire to return to Athens, while the tyrant delayed with excuses, promises, and veiled threats. The situation became a polite form of house arrest, with the philosopher's movements restricted and his correspondence monitored. The man who had once written about the soul's liberation from the cave of illusion found himself literally imprisoned in a palace that had become his own cave of shadows and deception. Finally, after nearly a year of this psychological torture, international pressure forced Dionysius to allow his captive philosopher to depart. Archytas of Tarentum, the Pythagorean philosopher-statesman who had befriended Plato years earlier, sent an official embassy demanding the release of the Athenian on diplomatic grounds. Not wanting to provoke a conflict with powerful Tarentum, the tyrant reluctantly agreed to let Plato go. The philosopher escaped Syracuse for the second time, returning to Athens burned by experience, but not broken in spirit. He had attempted once again to unite philosophy with political power, and once again the experiment had ended in failure. The young tyrant had proven exactly what Plato had feared. That power, without genuine philosophical commitment, was still tyranny, regardless of how eloquently it might speak about justice and virtue. Back at the academy, Plato resumed his teaching and writing with renewed intensity, but also with a deeper understanding of the obstacles facing any attempt to realize philosophical ideals in the corrupt world of practical politics. His students listened as he recounted the disaster, and many drew the conclusion that the philosopher king was indeed an impossible dream, a noble vision that could exist only in the realm of pure theory. But the tragedy of Syracuse was far from over, and Plato's connection to that troubled city would drag him into one final catastrophic encounter with the brutal realities of political power. The story of Dion's exile was only the beginning of a sequence of events that would test every principle the philosopher held dear and ultimately destroy the man who had been his closest friend and most devoted student. In 361 BC, 6 years after Plato's second Sicilian journey, another message arrived from Syracuse. This time it came not from Dion, still languishing in exile, but from Dionysius II himself. The tyrant was sending a ship to Athens with what amounted to a royal summons disguised as an invitation. He promised that if Plato returned to Syracuse, he would reconcile with Dion, restore his confiscated properties, and genuinely commit himself to philosophical principles. This time, the tyrant claimed, everything would be different. Plato was now 66 years old, his hair white, his body bearing the accumulated weight of decades spent in intense intellectual labour. Every instinct told him that Dionysius's promises were lies, that the tyrant had learned nothing from their previous encounters, except perhaps how to manipulate more skillfully. The young ruler who had exiled his own brother-in-law for imagined threats was hardly likely to have undergone a genuine moral transformation in the intervening years. Yet the appeals came not only from Syracuse, but from Dion himself, who sent desperate letters from his exile, pleading with his old teacher to make one final attempt. Other friends joined their voices to his, including Archytas and several prominent Pythagoreans, who argued that Plato had an obligation to his philosophical principles, to his friendships, and to the possibility, however remote, that wisdom might yet triumph over power. The arguments were persuasive precisely because they appealed to Plato's deepest convictions. How could he advocate for the philosopher's duty to return to the cave and help free other prisoners if he himself refused to take risks for the sake of justice? How could he teach about courage and commitment to truth while choosing the safety of his academy over the dangerous work of practical reform? How could he abandon Dion, the student who had sacrificed everything for philosophical ideals? Against his better judgment, against the protests of students who begged him not to go, against every lesson taught by previous experience, Plato once again boarded a ship bound for Sicily. As the familiar coastline of Syracuse came into view, he must have known that he was sailing toward the final, tragic conclusion of a philosophical experiment that had been doomed from its very beginning. He arrived to find, as expected, that Dionysius's promises had been empty from the start. The tyrant had no intention of reconciling with Dion or restoring his properties. The philosophical commitment was as hollow as before, a performance designed to flatter the ruler's vanity rather than transform his character. But this time, Dionysius was not content merely to hold Plato as an honoured prisoner. The ageing philosopher found his own property in Syracuse confiscated, his movements severely restricted, and his life openly threatened by soldiers who resented his presence and influence. The situation became genuinely life-threatening when court factions turned against the philosopher with increasing viciousness. Plato managed to smuggle out a secret message to Archytas in Tarentum, desperately requesting rescue from what had become a death trap. The Pythagorean responded by sending another official embassy, this time with an ultimatum rather than a polite request. Dionysius, not wanting to risk war with a powerful ally over the fate of one elderly philosopher, reluctantly allowed Plato to escape. The third and final journey to Syracuse was over, and with it ended forever any possibility that Plato would personally attempt to create a philosopher king. He returned to Athens and made a solemn vow that he would never again set foot in Sicily. The dream of uniting wisdom and power through education and persuasion had proven not merely difficult, but impossible. Philosophy and tyranny were fundamentally incompatible forces that could not coexist in the same space without mutual destruction. But even as Plato renounced any further involvement in Sicilian politics, the forces he had set in motion continued their inexorable course toward tragedy. Dion, still in exile and burning with a combination of philosophical idealism and personal resentment, had spent the years gathering resources and allies for a desperate gamble that would either vindicate everything Plato had taught about justice or demonstrate its complete irrelevance to the real world of political power. In 357 BC, Dion launched his invasion of Syracuse with a small but determined force of mercenaries and exiled supporters. The city, weary of Dionysius II's erratic rule and heavy taxation, welcomed the returning exile as a liberator. The tyrant fled without offering serious resistance, and for a brief, shining moment, it seemed that philosophical principles might finally triumph in the political realm. Dion took control of Syracuse and began implementing reforms directly inspired by Plato's teachings. He attempted to create a more just distribution of wealth, to limit the arbitrary power that had characterized tyrannical rule, and to govern according to rational principles rather than personal whim or popular passion. Here at last was a student of philosophy actually ruling a major city, trying to transform theory into practice on a massive scale. But Syracuse was poisoned by decades of factional violence, mutual suspicion, and the kind of moral corruption that made genuine political reform nearly impossible to achieve. Dion faced resistance from democrats who wanted popular rule, from oligarchs who wanted to preserve their privileges, from mercenaries who cared only about regular pay, and from ordinary citizens who simply wanted stability after years of chaos and conflict. The philosophical ruler, who should have been able to unite these competing interests through wisdom and justice, instead found himself increasingly isolated and autocratic. The very principles that were supposed to guide his rule came into conflict with the practical necessities of maintaining power in a hostile environment. Idealism collided with the reality, and reality proved stronger. Dion's rule lasted only 3 years before ending in the most bitter possible way. In 354 BC, he was assassinated not by political enemies or rival factions, but by someone within his own inner circle. The murderer was Callippus, a supposed friend and fellow student of Plato, a man who had fought alongside Dion against the tyranny and then betrayed him for the sake of personal ambition. When news of the assassination reached Athens, Plato was devastated beyond measure. His closest friend, the man who had embodied his highest hopes for the union of philosophy and politics, was dead, murdered not by enemies of wisdom, but by someone who had learned to speak eloquently about justice while pursuing only his own advancement. The betrayal cut deeper than any previous disappointment because it came from within the philosophical community itself. Syracuse collapsed into civil war, a nightmare of competing tyrants and factions that made the previous chaos seem mild by comparison. The city that might have become a beacon of philosophical governance instead became a cautionary tale about the impossibility of implementing ideal justice in a corrupt world. Everything Plato had worked for, everything Dion had died for, crumbled into dust within months of the assassination. In the aftermath of this final catastrophe, Plato wrote what many scholars consider his most revealing work, the seventh letter, addressed to the surviving members of Dion's faction in Syracuse. Whether the letter is authentic or a later fabrication remains debated, but its content perfectly captures the mood of a man forced to confront the complete failure of his most cherished hopes. In this document, Plato reflects on the entire Sicilian adventure with a mixture of grief, anger, and hard-won wisdom. He concludes that philosophy and politics are fundamentally incompatible in any state where the people are not properly educated, where institutions have been corrupted by years of tyranny, and where power is typically seized through violence rather than earned through virtue. A true philosopher cannot rule justly in such circumstances because justice requires the cooperation of citizens who understand and value it. The letter represents Plato's final word on practical politics, his definitive abandonment of the dream that had driven him since witnessing Socrates' execution more than 40 years earlier. The philosopher king might exist in the ideal realm described in the Republic, but in the actual world of human affairs, wisdom and power would remain forever separate, dwelling in different spheres that could touch only briefly and at great cost to both. Returning to Athens for the final time, the aged philosopher turned away from the corrupted world of politics and deeper into the pure realm of philosophical contemplation. His remaining years would be devoted not to transforming existing societies, but to understanding the eternal truths that transcended all human institutions. If justice could not be realized in Syracuse or Athens, perhaps it existed in a higher dimension, accessible only to souls properly prepared through mathematical study and dialectical reasoning. The academy continued to flourish, attracting students from across the Mediterranean world who came to study not practical politics, but the abstract sciences that revealed unchanging reality beneath the flux of temporal affairs. Plato's late dialogues grew increasingly technical and metaphysical, moving further from the practical concerns that had once consumed him toward the mathematical and cosmological speculations that would influence centuries of subsequent thought. Yet even in retreat from political engagement, Plato could not entirely abandon the questions that had tormented him throughout his life. How should human beings live together in communities? What form of government best promotes justice and happiness? These concerns found expression in his longest and final work, The Laws, a massive dialogue that represented his most mature thinking about practical political arrangements. Unlike the Republic, with its radical proposals for philosopher kings and the abolition of private property, the Laws described what Plato called the second best state, a realistic constitution designed for actual human beings who would never achieve philosophical wisdom. Gone were the utopian elements that had made the Republic so controversial. In their place was a detailed legal code covering everything from property disputes to religious festivals, from marriage laws to criminal punishment. The Laws represented wisdom chastened by experience, idealism tempered by decades of observing human nature in all its complexity and contradiction. If philosophers could not rule, at least laws could be crafted to channel human behavior in constructive directions, creating institutions that would promote virtue even among citizens incapable of understanding its ultimate foundations. But perhaps most remarkably, even as Plato grew more pessimistic about politics, he never lost faith in the transformative power of education itself. The academy remained his greatest achievement, a living demonstration that human beings could be changed through proper instruction, that minds could be awakened to truths beyond the shadows of conventional opinion. Within the academy's gardens, brilliant discussions continued daily as students and teachers explored questions that had fascinated Plato since his youth. What is real? What is good? How should we live? The conversations were no longer aimed at preparing philosopher kings to rule cities, but they retained their power to transform individual souls, to liberate minds from the prison of unexamined assumptions. And among those engaged in these eternal questions was a young man whose presence would ensure that Plato's influence extended far beyond anything the master could have imagined. Aristotle had now been at the academy for nearly 2 decades, growing from a promising student into a formidable thinker whose ideas were beginning to diverge significantly from those of his teacher. The debates between Plato and Aristotle during these final years must have been extraordinary intellectual spectacles, with other Academy members gathering to witness these titans of thought clash over the most fundamental questions of philosophy. Where Plato looked upward toward eternal forms, Aristotle looked downward toward the living world of plants and animals. Where Plato sought truth through mathematical reasoning, Aristotle insisted that knowledge must begin with careful observation of particular things. These disagreements were not merely academic, but represented fundamentally different ways of understanding reality itself. Plato believed that the physical world was a pale reflection of eternal truths existing in a higher dimension. Aristotle argued that universals existed within particular things, rather than in some separate realm, making the forms unnecessary metaphysical baggage that explain nothing while creating new problems. As Plato entered his 70s, these philosophical differences became more pronounced, setting the stage for the intellectual revolution that would follow his death. But for now, master and student continued their daily walks through the Academy's olive groves, their conversations ranging across every domain of human knowledge, their minds still restless in pursuit of understanding, despite the accumulating weight of years and disappointment. The physical world that Plato had always distrusted was beginning to assert its claims on his aging body. His eyesight dimmed, his hearing weakened, his energy flagged. But his intellectual powers remained formidable, his curiosity undiminished, his commitment to the examined life as strong as ever. He continued writing, continued teaching, continued pursuing the questions that had consumed more than half a century of relentless inquiry. The Academy had become his true legacy, an institution that would outlast empires and preserve the spirit of philosophical investigation long after its founder had departed. Students came and went, carrying Plato's methods to distant cities, establishing new schools, spreading the conviction that truth was worth pursuing, regardless of practical consequences. But even as his influence spread across the ancient world, Plato remained haunted by the fundamental questions that had driven him since that terrible day in an Athenian courtroom. Could justice ever truly exist among human beings? Was the good life possible in a world of corruption and violence? Did the soul's immortality provide hope for ultimate vindication of virtue, or was philosophy merely an elaborate form of self-deception? These questions would follow him to the end, unresolved but not abandoned, eternal challenges that each new generation would have to face anew. The man who had spent his life seeking certainty had discovered instead the inexhaustible mystery of existence itself, and in that discovery had perhaps found something more valuable than any final answers could have provided. The exact year remains uncertain. Some sources say 348 BC, others 347 BC, depending on which ancient chronology you follow. Plato was 80 or 81 years old, an extraordinary age for the ancient world, a lifespan that had stretched across nearly a century of Greek history. The accounts of his death vary, wrapped in the same kind of legend that had surrounded his life. One tradition claims he died at a wedding feast, surrounded by music and celebration, a fitting end, perhaps, for the author of the Symposium who had written so beautifully about love and philosophical communion. Another more widely accepted version says he died peacefully in his sleep, in his own bed, during the quiet hours of the night, when the soul was said to be closest to the eternal realm he had spent his life trying to describe. There were no recorded final words, unlike his teacher Socrates, who had spent his last day in philosophical conversation and left that strange, enigmatic instruction about the rooster owed to Asclepius. Plato seems to have simply slipped away. No trial, no poison, no injustice, just the natural conclusion of a long and fully examined life. Some sources suggest he was found in the morning with a stylus still nearby, perhaps having been working even in his final hours on the laws, the massive dialogue some believe he left unfinished. The image is both poignant and fitting. the philosopher at work until the very end, the examined life pursued to the last breath, the mind that had never stopped questioning finally at rest. His body was prepared for burial according to Athenian custom, while the academy community grieved. They had lost not just a teacher, but the centre of their intellectual universe, the man who had founded their school and defined its mission for 4 decades. Funeral rites were performed, eulogies delivered by those who had known him best. The question of where he was buried has 2 answers in the ancient sources. Some say he was laid to rest in the academy grounds themselves, allowing him to remain in spirit where he had spent his most productive years. Others claim he was interred in the Ceramicus, Athens' great cemetery, where the city honoured its most distinguished citizens. Either way, the grave marker was likely simple, in keeping with the philosophical life's rejection of ostentation and worldly display. Speusippus, Plato's nephew, was chosen to succeed him as scholarch, head of the academy. It was not an obvious choice, and the fact that Aristotle, by far the most brilliant student Plato had ever taught, was passed over speaks to complex factors. Perhaps it reflected the growing divergence between master and pupil, perhaps simple politics within the school, or perhaps the recognition that Aristotle's ideas were leading him in directions too radical for the academy's established traditions. Aristotle left Athens shortly after Plato's death, eventually settling in Assos in Asia Minor, before later returning to found his own school, the Lyceum. The 2 institutions would become rival centres of learning, representing different streams of Greek philosophical thought. Where the academy emphasised mathematics and the ascent to eternal truths, the Lyceum would focus on empirical observation and the systematic classification of natural phenomena. Athens itself recognised the magnitude of the loss. Here was a citizen who had brought honour to the city not through military conquest or political power, but through wisdom, through the relentless pursuit of truth, through the creation of an institution that would educate generations of leaders and thinkers. The man who had once been exiled in all but name after his teacher's execution was now mourned as one of the city's greatest sons. But Plato's death was not the end of his influence. It was barely the beginning. The ideas he had developed during 8 decades of life would prove more durable than bronze or marble, more persistent than any empire, more transformative than any military victory. The academy itself would continue for nearly 1,000 years, making it the longest-running institution of higher learning in human history. Under Speusippus, the school maintained its founder's emphasis on mathematics and dialectic, though with increasing attention to the mystical dimensions of Plato's thought. Students still walked the same garden paths where Plato had walked, still debated under the olive trees that had witnessed his conversations with Aristotle, still pursued the eternal questions he had made central to philosophical inquiry. But the academy's future would be marked by unexpected transformations that might have surprised its founder. Around 266 BC, nearly a century after Plato's death, Arcesilaus became scholarch and transformed the school's teaching in a radical direction. He argued that Socrates' true legacy was not the theory of forms, but his confession of ignorance. If Socrates had claimed to know nothing, Arcesilaus reasoned, then perhaps true knowledge was impossible for human beings. The academy became a school of skepticism, dedicated not to defending positive doctrines, but to examining and dismantling all dogmatic claims. Students learned to argue both sides of every question, to suspend judgment rather than commit to any particular theory, to embrace uncertainty as the most honest intellectual position. It was a strange fate for Plato's school, but perhaps not entirely unfaithful to the spirit of inquiry that had always characterized the master's approach. This skeptical phase continued under Carneades in the 2nd century BC, who refined the position into a form of probabilism. While absolute certainty might be impossible, he argued, we could still judge some beliefs as more likely than others and act on degrees of probability rather than dogmatic conviction. The mathematical certainty that Plato had sought was abandoned in favour of a more modest epistemological humility. In the 1st century BC, the academy shifted direction again under Antiochus of Ascalon, who led what he called a return to the true Plato. This phase, sometimes termed Middle Platonism, blended Platonic ideas with elements drawn from Stoicism and Aristotelian philosophy, creating synthetic systems that would prove enormously influential in the Roman world. Cicero, the great Roman orator and statesman, studied at the academy under Antiochus and carried Platonic concepts to Rome, translating Greek philosophical vocabulary into Latin and making these ideas accessible to a new culture. Through Cicero's works, Plato's influence began spreading beyond the Greek world into the emerging Roman Empire, where it would encounter and transform other intellectual traditions. Meanwhile, outside the official academy, new interpretations of Plato were emerging that would prove even more influential than the institutional tradition. In the 3rd century AD, as the Roman Empire staggered through crisis and traditional certainties collapsed, a philosopher named Plotinus reimagined Plato's vision with mystical intensity that would reshape Western thought for the next millennium. Plotinus had been born around 204 AD, likely in Egypt, and had studied in Alexandria before settling in Rome, where he gathered a devoted circle of students. His teachings, collected by his disciple Porphyry into a work called the Enneads, presented a systematic interpretation of Plato that emphasized the soul's journey from material imprisonment to mystical union with the divine. At the heart of Plotinus's system was the One, the absolute source of all reality, beyond being itself, beyond thought, beyond description. From the One emanated the intellect, the realm of Plato's forms, which in turn gave rise to the soul that animated the physical world. Reality was conceived as a descending hierarchy, each level a dimmer reflection of the original divine light. The human soul, according to this Neoplatonic vision, belonged by nature to the higher realms, but had descended into matter and become trapped in the body. Philosophy became a spiritual discipline aimed at the soul's return journey, climbing back up the ladder of emanation through purification, virtue, and contemplative practice. At the summit lay the possibility of mystical union, what Plotinus called the flight of the alone to the alone. This mystical interpretation of Plato proved extraordinarily appealing to the late ancient world, offering hope of transcendence in an age of political chaos and cultural dissolution. The Neoplatonic tradition continued through figures like Iamblichus, who added ritual practices meant to invoke divine assistance, and Proclus, who systematized the entire vision with scholastic precision. But perhaps most significantly for the future of Western civilization, Neoplatonism profoundly influenced the development of Christian theology. Augustine, the greatest of the Latin Church Fathers, encountered Neoplatonic texts in Milan before his conversion to Christianity. The vision of an immaterial realm of eternal truth, of the soul's fallen condition and need for redemption, of the good as the source of all being. These ideas prepared him intellectually and spiritually to accept Christian doctrine. In Augustine's mature theology, Plato's forms became the eternal ideas in the mind of God, not a separate realm, but the thoughts of the Creator, according to which all things were made. The soul's journey became a return to God through grace, rather than philosophical contemplation alone. Time and eternity, earth and heaven, the city of man and the city of God, all these fundamental Christian distinctions carried Platonic structure, even as they transformed Platonic content. For nearly 1,000 years, medieval Christianity would be dominated by this Christianized Platonism. Monasteries preserved and copied Platonic texts. Scholars debated the relationship between reason and faith using Platonic categories. mystics described their experiences of divine union in language borrowed from Plotinus and his successors. The ancient philosopher who had died in pagan Athens became, through these transformations, one of the architects of Christian civilization. Only in the 13th century, when Aristotle's complete works were rediscovered and translated from Arabic, would Thomas Aquinas attempt a grand synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology. But even then, Platonic elements remained embedded in the very foundations of medieval thought, too deeply rooted to be entirely displaced by the new Aristotelianism. When the Renaissance began in the 14th and 15th centuries, it was marked by a conscious return to classical sources and a rejection of what humanists saw as the barbarous corruptions of medieval culture. But this return to antiquity was simultaneously a return to Plato, whose complete works had been largely lost to Western Europe during the medieval period. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 brought Greek scholars fleeing to the West, carrying precious manuscripts that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries for centuries. Among these treasures was the complete corpus of Plato's dialogues, which had not been available in Latin translation since the ancient world. Cosimo de' Medici, the de facto ruler of Florence and a passionate patron of learning, immediately recognized the significance of these texts. He commissioned Marsilio Ficino to produce the first complete Latin translation of Plato ever made in the West, a monumental project that Ficino completed in 1484 after decades of painstaking work. The impact was revolutionary. For the first time in nearly 1,000 years, Europeans could read the Republic, the Symposium, the Phaedo, and the other great dialogues in their entirety. The effect on Renaissance culture was immediate and profound. Humanists discovered in Plato a vision of human dignity and potential that seemed to justify their rebellion against medieval authority and their confidence in human reason. Ficino also established a new Platonic academy in Florence. Not a formal school like the original, but a circle of scholars, artists, and thinkers who gathered to discuss philosophy, beauty, and the soul's ascent to divine truth. This Renaissance academy became the intellectual heart of humanist culture, influencing art, literature, politics, and theology throughout Europe. Artists embraced the theory of forms with revolutionary enthusiasm, understanding their task not as mere imitation of natural appearances, but as the revelation of eternal beauty through material media. Michelangelo famously declared that his sculptures already existed complete within the marble blocks, requiring only the removal of excess stone to free them. This was pure Platonism applied to artistic creation. Leonardo da Vinci filled his notebooks with studies of mathematical proportions, seeking the ideal ratios that governed beauty in the human face and form. Architects like Andrea Palladio designed buildings based on perfect mathematical relationships, creating structures meant to embody the harmony and proportion that Plato had identified with ultimate reality. In literature, the concept of Platonic love became central to courtly poetry and romance. Writers like Petrarch, Dante, and later Edmund Spenser celebrated love as a spiritual force that elevated the soul toward divine beauty, transforming physical desire into intellectual and spiritual contemplation. The ladder of ascent that Plato had described in the Symposium became a common literary metaphor for the soul's journey from earthly to heavenly love. Political theorists revived the dream of the ideal city, inspired by Plato's Republic, to imagine perfect societies governed by reason rather than force or tradition. Thomas More's Utopia described an island commonwealth organized according to philosophical principles, while Tommaso Campanella's City of the Sun presented a detailed blueprint for a state ruled by wisdom and virtue. The Renaissance rebirth of classical learning was in large measure a rebirth of Plato, whose ideas proved as relevant to 16th century Europeans as they had been to 4th century Greeks. The questions he had asked about reality, knowledge, beauty, love, and justice seemed eternal, transcending the particular circumstances of any historical period. But as the Renaissance gave way to the early modern period, Plato's influence would take new forms, shaping the development of modern philosophy, science, and political theory in ways that would have astonished the ancient academy. The dialogues that had been written in an olive grove outside Athens would help create the intellectual foundations of the modern world, proving that some ideas are indeed immortal and that the pursuit of wisdom remains humanity's highest calling across all ages and cultures. The 17th and 18th centuries witnessed a great philosophical divide between rationalists and empiricists, and this fundamental debate was essentially an argument over Plato's legacy. The rationalists, led by figures like Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, were Platonic in spirit even when they rejected specific Platonic doctrines. They believed that reason alone could discover the deepest truths about reality, that mathematical knowledge was innate rather than learned from experience, that the mind possessed ideas not derived from the senses. Descartes' method of systematic doubt led him to the certainty of the thinking self, a move that echoed Plato's emphasis on the soul as the true self distinct from the material body. His belief that clear and distinct ideas could serve as foundations for certain knowledge reflected the Platonic confidence that reason could grasp eternal truths. Even his dualism of mind and matter, though formulated in mechanistic terms, preserved the essential Platonic distinction between the material and immaterial realms. The empiricists, particularly Locke and Hume, mounted what amounted to an Aristotelian revolt against this Platonic tradition. They insisted that all knowledge comes from sensory experience, that the mind at birth is a blank slate, that abstract entities like Platonic forms are mere fictions generated by language and habit. This was a systematic rejection of everything Plato had taught about innate knowledge, eternal truths, and the superiority of reason over the senses. Immanuel Kant's critical philosophy represented a brilliant synthesis that transformed both traditions while preserving essential Platonic insights. Kant distinguished between phenomena, things as they appear to us through the categories of human understanding, and noumena, things as they exist in themselves beyond all possible experience. This distinction closely paralleled Plato's separation of the physical world from the realm of forms, though Kant insisted that we could never know the noumenal realm directly. Kant's categorical imperative, the moral law that commands us to act only according to principles we could will to be universal laws, reflected the Platonic conviction that ethical truth is absolute and discoverable through reason rather than derived from empirical observation of human behavior. The autonomy of the rational will that Kant celebrated as the foundation of human dignity echoed Plato's vision of the soul's capacity to transcend material determination through philosophical understanding. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's dialectical method represented perhaps the most ambitious attempt since Plotinus to create a comprehensive philosophical system on Platonic foundations. Hegel's conviction that reality itself was fundamentally rational, that contradictions in thought and experience were not mere problems to be avoided, but the very engine of progress toward absolute knowledge, transformed Plato's dialectical method into a cosmic principle. The absolute idea that Hegel placed at the summit of his system, the fully realized rational structure of reality that encompassed and reconciled all finite perspectives, clearly descended from Plato's form of the good. Even Hegel's philosophy of history, which saw human development as the progressive realization of freedom through rational institutions, preserved the Platonic vision of an ideal state while historicizing it in ways Plato never imagined. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries embraced Platonic themes with passionate intensity, particularly the doctrine of recollection and the soul's pre-existence. William Wordsworth's Ode intimations of immortality from recollections of early childhood explicitly drew on Platonic ideas about the soul's journey from a heavenly origin into earthly embodiment, describing how the child comes trailing clouds of glory from God, who is our home. Samuel Taylor Coleridge distinguished between fancy, which merely rearranges sensory materials, and imagination, which participates in the eternal creative power that shapes reality itself. This distinction preserved the Platonic hierarchy that placed intellectual intuition above sensory experience, while giving it a specifically aesthetic application that would influence literary theory for generations. Percy Bysshe Shelley's Defense of Poetry argued that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world because they perceive eternal truths that transcend the particular circumstances of their historical moment. This was pure Platonism, celebrating the artist's capacity to glimpse the forms and translate their vision into works that could awaken similar insights in others. But the 19th century also brought unprecedented challenges to Platonic assumptions about reality, knowledge, and value. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution suggested that species were not eternal forms, but mutable products of natural selection operating over vast periods of time. The fixed essences that had seemed so fundamental to Platonic metaphysics appeared to dissolve into historical processes of change and adaptation. Karl Marx turned Plato's idealism on its head, arguing that material conditions of production determined the development of ideas rather than the other way around. Where Plato had seen the physical world as a pale reflection of eternal truths, Marx insisted that intellectual and cultural phenomena were products of economic relationships between social classes struggling for control of material resources. Friedrich Nietzsche launched perhaps the most systematic assault on Platonic values in the history of philosophy, identifying Plato as the architect of a true world that devalued this world, a life-denying metaphysics that had poisoned Western civilization for over 2 millennia. Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead was simultaneously an attack on the Christian appropriation of Platonic transcendence and a call for humanity to create new values rather than discover eternal ones. Yet even these radical critiques testified to Plato's continuing centrality in Western thought. You cannot reject what lacks influence, and the very vehemence of these attacks demonstrated how deeply Platonic assumptions had penetrated European culture. Moreover, each critique inadvertently preserved elements of the Platonic heritage even while rejecting others. Darwin's emphasis on the struggle between different forms of life echoed the Platonic conviction that reality involves fundamental conflicts that must be resolved at higher levels of organization. Marx's vision of a classless society where human potential could be fully realized preserved the utopian dimension of Plato's Republic, while grounding it in material rather than spiritual transformation. Even Nietzsche's call for the creation of new values reflected the Platonic confidence that human beings could transcend their immediate circumstances through the exercise of reason and will. And so we reach the end of one of the most extraordinary lives in human history. From that young aristocrat watching his teacher drink hemlock in an Athenian prison cell, to the aged philosopher breathing his last breath surrounded by manuscripts and memories, Plato's journey transformed not just his own understanding, but the very foundations of how we think about reality, justice, and the meaning of existence itself. Think about what we've witnessed together. A man who could have lived comfortably as another wealthy Athenian politician instead chose to spend 8 decades asking the hardest questions human beings can ask. He watched democracy destroy itself, witnessed tyranny masquerade as wisdom, and saw his closest friends murdered for their ideals. Yet he never stopped believing that truth was worth pursuing, that justice was worth seeking, that the examined life was the only life worth living. The academy he founded lasted nearly 1,000 years, longer than most empires. His dialogues survived the fall of Rome, shaped medieval Christianity, inspired the Renaissance, and continue to influence every major philosophical debate today. Every time a mathematician discovers a new theorem, every time a scientist seeks eternal laws behind changing phenomena, every time a political theorist imagines a more just society, they walk in Plato's footsteps. But perhaps most remarkably, the questions that drove Plato remain as urgent today as they were 24 centuries ago. What is justice? What is real? How should we live? Can politics ever be truly moral? These aren't ancient curiosities, but the living challenges that define human existence in every generation. Plato gave us something more valuable than answers. He gave us the conviction that these questions matter, that truth is worth seeking even when it costs everything, and that the unexamined life truly is not worth living. In a world still torn between wisdom and power, still struggling with justice and corruption, still searching for meaning beyond the shadows on the cave wall, Plato's voice echoes across the centuries, challenging us to think deeper, question harder, and never stop reaching toward the light of understanding. That is the complete life of Plato, a life that proved ideas can be more durable than empires, and that the pursuit of wisdom remains humanity's greatest adventure.